morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. My background on the short bio, I don't go all the way back, but for ham radio, I think it's important to know. I got started as a paramedic firefighter, was a volunteer firefighter. My family's from Florida. So when everybody says they're first generation, I'm like, yeah, you're still a Yankee. My mama's from Scriven. So I got my Southeast Georgia roots. And when I got out of high school, I became a volunteer firefighter. Went to EMT school, became a paramedic, and ultimately I went to the Florida State Fire College. And I thought my career was going to be in the fire service. I was a lieutenant fire rescue. And I remember this date because, there's certain things you remember. There's things you forget, like your anniversary, but there's some dates you remember. I got a phone call in February 1987 asking me to go downtown to fire rescue headquarters and work on a project. I just got promoted to lieutenant, and the thing they wanted to do was all of the people that had been in the field had never been in a supervisory role, nor had they ever worked in administration. So their theory was they'd take us from the field and put us in an office for 2 weeks and see if they couldn't get us to understand that administration wasn't the enemy. Because that's how you looked at it when you're in the field. It was like people in headquarters don't know what they're doing, let the people in the field do their job. So that was in February 1987. The project I got was updating the county's disaster plan. And I was actually taking some courses through the University of Cincinnati. This is really one of the first distant learning courses you took. And I remember you guys talking earlier about the first computers and 300 baud modems. I remember doing bulletin boards and sending my assignments up to the University of Cincinnati on the bulletin board they'd set up. And of course, I had upgraded by that time. I had a 24 baud modem. What happened was kind of interesting. I did the plan, then I was asked to update a new elected county commissioner on the plan. And at that time, they really didn't have anybody in my county doing emergency management. It was kind of a multi-hat deal. And I'm from Gainesville, Florida, so this is Alachua County. And I did the briefing, and the county manager looked at my boss and said, "Who's this guy, and why haven't I ever seen him before?" He said, "Well, he's one of our lieutenants who just got promoted and everything." He says, "Well, to this effect, my talents were wasted in the field, and I never went back on the road." So I always know February 1987 is when I started in emergency management, and I never went back to fire rescue. I started doing that. I did that for 10 years. Dealt with a variety of things, fires, chemical emergencies. But one of the first groups that reached out to me was the amateur radio folks. And again, I found myself walking in a situation where a lot of relationships had been broken, a lot of things weren't updated, and I was brand new to this. I was like, throw me a lifeline. And the hams reached out to me, and they started talking about what they could do and their services. And my question to them was, "What do you need from me?" And they were kind of taken aback, because generally they were just trying to get somebody to listen to them, much less go, "Well, what do you need?" And one of our first big projects was running brand new coax in the county administration building from the roof, which was 5 stories up, down to the basement where the EOC was. And so we could get, both the 2-meter equipment up and also get HF up. And so I started working with the guys. We did something kind of unusual at that time. I'm not sure how many bulldogs are in the room, but I'll try not to offend you too much, but I'm a big obnoxious gator as well. University of Florida, and this is before cellular technology and everything else, used to have ham radio operators come in and serve as spotters in crow's nest around the periphery of the stadium, and they call down when they see people passing out, usually in the student section, but every now and then in the alumni section, heart attacks and whatever. And because I was the emergency management guy and I talked to the hams, next thing I knew, I was coordinating with the amateur radio folks these stadium games. So I was, 6 to 7 times a year, we were doing these huge, 80,000 plus people events with amateur radio. And I guess we were just seeing so much stuff going on. We ended up formalizing, set up a command post using ham radio operators to relay. We'd get a lot of calls during these games. And so I started out working with amateur radio a recurring basis and saw the value of it. And as I went through my 10 years there, we had a couple of notable communication failures. One that was kind of interesting was we lost our phone line to the transmitters. As we saw dispatch centers moving downtown, but transmitters moving out of the way, very few dispatch centers actually transmit from where their 911 center is located. And I started realizing we had these failure points that people were just not paying attention to. So we lost the communications. And so we got 911 calls coming in, and we can't talk to any of the EMS or fire units. And at least within the downtown Gainesville area, we got a mobile unit out there, and their radio could talk a couple of miles. And so we were able to get some comm back up. But the outlying areas we couldn't get to. And we got 9 municipalities in Lawrenceville County. That's where the volunteer fire departments are, City of Gainesville, the big city. But 8 of those locations, we couldn't talk to those. And so we got 911 calls coming in, and there was no way to talk out to those volunteer units. And this occurred like that. This was not a storm. This was a mechanical, I think somebody ended up cutting a cable and we lost it. And what was interesting was the other phones worked. So I was able to call the hams. They started their tree. They came in. And what we did, and we never practiced this, but we had practiced losing the repeater. So what we did was we sent hams to every one of those fire stations. And we were able to communicate from the dispatch center, again, on 2 meters through the repeaters to those outlying areas. And we were able to get those, and again, they were calling people out there saying, hey, we've lost the radios. Can you get somebody to the station in case we get a call? And we were able to, within about an hour, reestablish communications with 8 of those fire stations that were anywhere from 10 to 20 miles from dispatch, using 2-meter radios going through the repeater. So if a call came in to 911 that had to go like High Springs, then we would relay the information through the ham radio operators to the radio operators that were in High Springs, who could then tell the fire truck. And then once they got going, they could talk among themselves. But that initial dispatch was really done by amateur radio. It was not something we planned, but we had relationships and we could figure it out and did it pretty quick. But it brought me back to this point that I don't think people realize how many places there's single points of failure in their survivable emergency communication systems. Because I kept finding out that every time somebody told me that the systems were, we don't need amateur radio. We got, got 800 megahertz. We got generators. We got all this backup. We got batteries. I'm like, you know how many times in my career that's failed? And so as I moved up through my career, I always maintained a good relationship with the ham radios. When I got to the state of Florida, we have 3 area sections. We're a big enough state. We have the North Florida section, which I'm part of, West Central Florida, which is the Tampa Bay region, and then South Florida, which is pretty much everything, Orlando South. And we went through a lot of things. Again, the hurricanes of 2004, 2005. And then one of the things that happened in 2005, which I thought was pretty notable, was we launched one of the largest public emergency management mutual aid to Hurricane Katrina. Florida ended up sending over 6,000 responders to Mississippi. And the majority of that was not National Guard, as what a lot of other states did. But when we sent our team, and we didn't distinguish between paid and unpaid. A lot of times people talk about, volunteers, and I'm like, I have a little bit of different approach in Florida. We looked at amateur radio as unpaid employees. If the state sent you, or you were activated by local, you were actually covered under state workman's comp laws if you were sent and dispatched in part of that organization. And we ended up sending a lot of folks to Mississippi, including ham radio operators, under our state emergency response team as part of our mutual aid agreement. So from my very beginning all the way through, we had been very heavily invested in using amateur radio operators. We had the ham radio station that was in our state warning point. We, practiced a lot of that stuff. Anytime we had a major activation or we're doing hurricane season, the local amateur radio folks in Tallahassee, supported by the surrounding counties, basically the agreement was the North Florida section would staff the state EOC because it was there. So we had hams working in the state warning point, handling traffic and communications. And again, I think for a lot of people, it was like, yeah, the comms are still, we got reasonably good comms. Do we really need them? I'm like, at the point you need them, it's when everything breaks. And so even when we weren't having to pass a lot of ham traffic, we just did it because that was the way we were building our plans. So when I got to FEMA, I saw almost a total disdain for ham radio. And I had done something when I was in Florida, when I did my exercises. I would do no notice exercises. We call them thunderbolts. And I was pretty ruthless about them. And I'd walk into the warning point or state EOC, and I would give them a communication drill. And I just ran one for the state of Florida 2 weeks ago. And it's relevant to this because if you've been watching the headlines and you've been watching any of the information coming out of the Department of Homeland Security, Critical Infrastructure and Security Administration, or CISA, the threats on cyber. And if you watch what's happened in the Ukraine, where the Russians have gone after some of the communication infrastructure, what could happen. And so I walked in, this was unannounced to the state team. The only person that knew I was coming up there was the exercise director. And I'd been asked by the state director to do this. And I walked in, I said, here's the scenario. You got all this background stuff about cyber attacks, the cyber threats, they're going after 911 systems, they're going after communications. And as I keep having to remind people, the communications that we think of, the phone systems, are not the phone systems when I grew up, which were the copper wired, big sulfuric batteries designed to survive nuclear war, linked together with microwave towers, at least in Florida, had basically built for 300-mile-an-hour winds to survive a nuclear attack. That system has been replaced from analog to digital. The copper has gone away, they've gone to fiber. And the protocol is now IP. It's all internet protocol. And when people talk about cyber, they're always worried about them turning off the power. And I'm like, actually, for emergency management, turning off the power would be something we could deal with. We would at least understand that. What I don't think people realize is that as we continue to develop and build these systems, we've actually created even bigger vulnerabilities. Our communication systems are all internet addressed. And just because they haven't taken them down doesn't mean they can't. And as we've seen in Ukraine, they did something interesting. They went after the ground control stations. They went after routers and wreaked havoc on the ability of Ukraine to manage some of their systems. So I gave that scenario and I said, here's what's happened. And I said, this was the artificiality of the exercise, because otherwise you'd be discovering things weren't working. I just walked in and said, it ain't working. I took out all of their radios. I didn't take out the state radio system. I took out all of their phones. I took out the internet. I took out their email. I took out all their social media, text messaging, anything that touched the internet was dead. I left them basically their state law enforcement radio system, which is a microwave system that runs off, it uses IP, but it's not connected to the internet. And that was it. I said, you got radios. And I said, you need to contact 67 counties in Florida. You need to contact the 7 National Weather Service offices that provide forecasts for county warning areas in Florida. You got to contact the 2 operational nuclear power plants. You got to contact the Hurricane Center. And you need to contact the National Guard headquarters, which is located in St. Augustine. And you got to reach all of your emergency coordinating officers for your state agencies. And they looked at me like blank. Like, what? I'm like, you've lost your phones, you lost the internet, there's no social media, you got statewide law enforcement radio. I could hear, and I knew at 9 o'clock, because I lost the exercise, I could hear the North Florida ARRL going in the background in the radio in the state warning point. And they had hams there. And they were just like, what can we do? And finally, they started figuring out and moving. And one of the people wrote in the exercise that this was not a realistic exercise. It was not credible. And I'm like, really? I was at the state warning point. They have 2 fiber lines going in from different places. The state EOC there was built after Hurricane Andrew. It's in a hardened building. They had redundancy on redundancy on redundancy. And they said, there's no way we're going to lose the 2 fiber lines coming in. They were separate. They both came in, terminated. And the idea being if one went down, the other one would always be up. I was there today. Somebody took a backhoe through one of them, and the other one got disconnected when they were doing some work in another part of the state government complex, and we had nothing. And you know how much lead time we had for that one? When somebody picked up the phone, that it wasn't working. So I go back to this idea that in dealing with emergency managers, they are so used to something like this working most of the time that they think this is an emergency communication device. In fact, we've kind of sold a bill of goods in the federal government to everybody on this thing called Firstnet, which is an AT&T system. This came out of the 9/11 Commission that the interoperability communication, because the firefighters and police officers and EMS folks couldn't talk to each other in New York City, needed to be addressed. And so the initial idea was to build a 700 megahertz dedicated public safety network for communities to be able to bridge that interoperable solution. Problem was, when it originally got bid out, nobody would bid on it except AT&T. And when the original bid came in, AT&T had proposed building a hard network. But over time, they said, well, we don't really need to build a new network. We just need to give them priority access on our existing network. So what most people don't understand is Firstnet just runs on the AT&T network, and there's nothing really spectacularly hardened about it. It's more of a piping and priority system for Firstnet equipment. But the system is still the AT&T system. So if you have crappy AT&T service, you're going to have the same thing with Firstnet. That's just day to day. But in disasters, it's a cellular-based system. And while everybody says, well, it's wireless, it's only wireless to the transmit receive function. Everything behind that is wired. And as we've seen, not exactly what I would call a resilient infrastructure for emergency communication. So when emergency managers said, well, ham radio is kind of like, that's civil defense. That's way back in the day. We got all these new things. We got satellite phones. We've got all this communication. We've got the internet. I'm like, okay, let's look at some real world examples. And I'm going to go to a slide presentation. I'm not going to use all of it, but let me go back here and hit share. All right, ham radio communications, yeah. All right. Can everybody see that slide?
Yes, sir.
As it comes up. All right. I'm just staying current. I'm not going way back in my past. When the derecho hit in Rapid City in 2020, turned out they lost everything. Their comms went down. The public safety agencies didn't know how to communicate. The only thing they had were their mobile radios because they lost their towers. They did not have a good plan for how they would put their communications back. But they lost cell. They lost their towers. And inside of that area, they literally had no way to communicate with the public or with each other. And it was a real delay in getting their response going. And again, this was, a derecho is basically a big gust front with tornado force winds, but they're straight line winds, unlike a tornado, and it's over a broader area, and they move extremely fast. And there was a lot of concerns. There wasn't enough heads up. There wasn't enough warning. Well, the Storm Prediction Center had been identifying the risk of significant weather, severe weather in this area a day or two before. So it wasn't like it was totally unexpected. But because nobody had been through a derecho and they had never practiced losing all their comms, they thrashed around a bit in that response. Hurricane Ida. Remember, AT&T is our provider of Firstnet. Well, Hurricane Ida hits downtown New Orleans, mainly with winds. Unlike Katrina, which was essentially a flood event, Ida produced very strong hurricane force winds over the city of New Orleans, which And Hurricane Katrina, they didn't get these winds. They got mainly tropical force with some hurricane gusts. Their big problem there was storm surge and flooding. But in Ida, it was wind. And it knocked out the 911 system. It knocked out the AT&T cellular service. And it knocked out FirstNet. And this was a bit of a, I would say, what we would call a Charlie Fox. And what was interesting was the local broadcast radio stations were, in many cases, the only way they had to inform the public what was going on because everything else was down. And the dependency on FirstNet, which everybody thought was a survivable communication system, became a rude awakening as it failed them. Then we had the Christmas explosion outside in Nashville. And initially, everybody just was trying to figure out what was going on, But over the next 8 hours, we started seeing all kinds of cascading communication failures. And it turned out what happened was that was an AT&T central office where they had multiple communication systems. They lost external power, but their batteries were working. Problem is, as the batteries failed and they couldn't get the generators back up or they were damaged, they started seeing cascading failures. Now think about this. Now this is a multi-state communication failures for anybody that was using the AT&T circuits. This was everything from FirstNet to cell phones to credit card transactions, states away from where this building got hit. And so, I kind of look at this from the standpoint of, when all else fails, it's ham radio. But it's only if you're trained and prepared, only if you can get on the air, and only if your local emergency management organizations know you and want your help. And I find that I spend probably less time talking to ham radio folks about this and more time about talking to the emergency management community, that this is I don't want to stop my share and go back to the talking head piece. Go down here. And so when I got to FEMA, I did some more no-notice exercises. And Ted Akata, who's on this call, is the Chief Technology Officer at FEMA. He's also a ham. FEMA has a lot of different roles. Most people think of it as just, the disaster response, but they also have some other government roles. And one of those roles is continuity government. What happens when the worst day happens? Everything from the cyber attacks to nuclear exchanges. And one of the things that FEMA maintains is a high frequency radio system for communicating from FEMA's locations to the 10 FEMA regions and to some of the states. And some of you may be familiar with their shares frequencies, where they have frequencies near our bands where they allow licensees to communicate on that. And a lot of local governments, at least in some parts of the Southeast, have been working with their local EMA and state to get those shares licensed and be able to do shares communication. My big hang up with that is they're too hung up on PACTOR, but that's their problem. And I walked in, and they test this thing weekly, or they told me they tested it weekly. So I walked into one of our locations and said, okay, this is a Thunderbolt. I want to contact all 10 regions right now. Well, this isn't a test day. I'm like, yeah, well, if something broke, we need to tell them we're going to do this. I'm like, well, if we had a cyber attack and we lost all our comms, how are you going to tell them? Well, they may not answer. I'm like, so this isn't 24 hours a day, 7 days a week survival communications. It only works when you do tests. Oh, no. Because we were spending a lot of money. I mean, these things had ALE, the automatic link stuff. They had, huge ass antenna rates. I mean, this is like, you go out these places as an amateur radio operator, and you just go, man, if I could get my wife past the size of this thing, if I just had this radio, in this antenna, I could talk anywhere. I mean, it's like amazing, the stuff out there. So we did a roll call out of 10 regions. And then they started telling me propagation wasn't good. And I'm like, well, duh, it happened right now. What do you mean? You got to wait until the propagation's better? Out of 10 FEMA regions, they were able to contact 6. 4 directly, 2 by relay, and 4 were down. Oh, so what happened? Well, it turned out one of the facilities had no antenna. It had been damaged, and they were waiting for somebody to come up with the money to replace it. I'm like, but you're showing that every week it's working. Well, we call them, as long as they answer the phone, we do the check-in. Have you guys ever been on a net where you have people relaying people in who weren't actually on the radio? Well, that's how they did their test. It's good if you're looking for 100% participation. It's not really a true indicator of who actually can, operate. So they were doing their net and checking people in by relays. Not necessarily they could talk on the radio, but they could, we checked in. One of them, all the equipment was in a locked closet and the person wasn't on duty. And if they weren't on duty, because they were the only one who knew how to work the damn thing, and had the key to that room, nobody else knew how to do it. So, and they only went in there when it was a test day. So there was no way for them to know anything going on. The other 2 were propagation issues. They were on the West Coast and they were in the 40-meter range, and it was just bad propagation that day. And I didn't even bother asking them at that point, well, can we go up to 20 meters and see if you can get them? What else do you got? No, they pretty much operated right where they were. And they weren't happy with me, because at that point, I just looked at millions of dollars in reoccurring cost and investment on a no notice event, which could replicate a bad day. 6 out of 10 FEMA regions we could reach. And I'm like, well, that's not acceptable. And it was, again, my point was, when you're doing your nets, when you're doing your training, when everybody expects stuff to work, it usually does. It's when you don't expect to need to do it, it's when it's off hours, it's all this other stuff that it doesn't. And so I've been pushing our local amateur radio group hard on what I think is a key role of amateur radio emergency services. Now, again, I kind of look at this from the periphery that I am a ham radio operator. I do participate, but I'm not that smart. I don't know everything. I'm just a general guy. But I know a lot on the disaster side. And when I first started working on our ARRL group, it seemed the number 1 priority was getting enough people that could work shelters. And I said, that's nice. But that's not really what I think our primary mission is. And we were working with the county. The county had actually been updating their disaster plans, and they were working on their hazard identification. And one of the things they had asked the local ARRL group, could we write something up for their emergency support function 2 on the roles and responsibilities of ham radio. And immediately the local ARRL group, which, basically the vest and 2-meter crowd, was, we got to go staff the shelters. And I'm like, that's nice. That's not critical. 99% of the time when you're staffing shelters, the communication is fine. All you're doing is providing a back channel to haul a bunch of information. And if you're not doing digital, it's even less useful. And they're saying, well, are you saying ham radio is critical? I'm like, no, I'm just saying that's something you do all the time. It's good. It's reoccurring. I give you something to train against. It's not critical. What's critical is, if we lose communications, can the county EOC talk to the state EOC? That's our first priority. And they never, again, I think people kind of like, well, yeah, that seems to be important. I said, look, what we really need to focus on is, if we lose communications, or in the advent of like Hurricane Michael, when it came through the Panhandle, it took out everything. And it turned out in that particular disaster, Verizon went down. And I actually found out why. Verizon was hanging their fiber on the utility poles because it was cheaper than burying it. So across an area that was basically from Panama City to almost to Tallahassee, north end to southwest Georgia, there was no communication. It was all gone. So the local EOCs, even their satellites, which states even got rid of that, that was blowing off the roof. No phone lines, no internet. RF was basically crapped out because their towers were blown over. And the only way they could get back to the state was when a ham showed up. And then propagation was so crappy that they ended up getting up on the air and talking to Jacksonville, 200 miles to the east to be able to get Jacksonville to call the state EOC, which was only about 30 or 40 miles away, because nobody at the state EOC ever heard of NIVETs. And it went back to this idea that think of the county EOC. And Georgia is very similar to Florida in that we're county based. You got sheriffs, you got the county EOCs, and you got a lot of counties. But the primary communication is, can that county EOC get back to the state EOC to say we need help or to give them sit reps? And most emergency managers are always looking at everything like this, or their computers, or their phone lines, or maybe some state law enforcement or other statewide radio system, and go, well, that's how we're going to communicate. I'm like, well, when it breaks, what happens? And this is an area that I found that with a lot of emergency managers, they have no clue that we now have tools like WinLink. We have, a lot of, digital modes that we can send quite a bit of traffic and not do the old voice stuff. Voice is still good. Voice is still, one of the basic things we practice, but they were like, well, we got to get these messages up there. We got to send these forms up. We got to do all that stuff. How are you guys going to do that? I'm like, well, we'll send them. We'll do WinLink. And we've been building, we have a Florida WinLink net. We've been building capability and trading with hams. The other thing we're finding is that when you lose repeaters, and particularly in my county, it's a fairly large county, you can't talk on 2 meters. It just doesn't have the range. So the local hams started practicing NIVETs. We do a 80-meter NIVETs nets every other Friday just to see who can check in, and we change it during the day. We'll go down to, go to 60 meters. We'll play around with 40 meters. And what we're trying to figure out is propagation changes, daytime to nighttime, disasters, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, what works. But it's driving this idea that the first thing we got to be able to do is get to the EOC, get the EOC connected to the state EOC, then get up around the county to those key nodes, fire stations, and start providing the initial direction control if everything else breaks. And there's enough current events to say this is not something that's remote, but it's also something that doesn't happen unless you've been practicing. Because if all of your ARRL plans have been around staffing EOCs, then or staffing the shelters, then you're basically depending upon repeaters. You're depending upon local voice nets, and you may not have built the muscle memory to be able to execute regional, statewide, multi-state communications. And that's where I think the real beauty of ham radio comes in, that isn't always appreciated by the emergency management community. So at FEMA, I began pushing this. One of the things that we did was we updated and signed a new memorandum of understanding with the ARRL. Ted's on this call. Ted's actually working to update this with the new leadership at the ARRL. It's kind of languished since I was there. But we still run into resistance, even within FEMA, that treat amateur radio as, yeah, they're nice people, but they're not really emergency communicators. They're not really, we're not going to count on them. We're not going to depend upon them. So I used to do this. I'd give people challenges. I would really push their buttons. When it said I was aggressively pushing, I was like, you don't understand. I was not a nice person. I could be a real pain in the butt. So I went during one of our continuity exercises. I gave my continuity folks a problem to solve. I said, you need to contact all 50 states, and you need to do it without touching the public switch network. And they said, what does that mean? I said, no internet, no phones, no satellites, because unless you got military satellites, all the satellites backhaul through Wallops or other locations and come back across the public switch network, which is internet based. And they're like, I said, look, just make contact with 50 states, the 10 FEMA regions, don't touch the public switch network, come back when you have a solution. They couldn't come up with a solution. They basically backed into the only thing they could think of. And the reason they did this is because my mobile emergency communication units, which you got one of the MERS detachments over in Thomasville, Georgia, had a lot of hams on there. And they suggested the national traffic system. And my folks were going, what the hell is the national traffic system? And again, for a lot of hams, you're going, is that still even up and running? And it turned out that about the only, and this is the federal government. I mean, this is, you got to understand, when FEMA may be, a lot of people think is an incompetent organization, depending upon whether you got turned down for assistance. But one of their missions, and this is a very high mission, so there's not nobody else doing this, is the continuity mission. That's it. FEMA's it. They work on behalf of the White House. And so if we suffered an EMP, a geomagnetic storm, a limited nuclear exchange, that's it. And I just asked the really smart folks that you as taxpayers have spent a lot of money on emergency communications. Could they do it without the public switch network? And the answer was no. They had to use ham radio. And they were starting to realize that even within the ham radio, almost all ARRLs is based upon localized to state. There's not really a national ARRLs program. The closest thing we had was the national traffic system. So they kind of backed into that answer, but they were very uncomfortable with it because it forced them to acknowledge that they couldn't do it without things and people that didn't work for them and they didn't control and were volunteers. But it was interesting to me that that was the best I could come up with. And I said, well, good. If that's the answer, we got to start working with it. Ted can tell you it was kind of an uneven approach as some of these folks began approaching the ARRL, started talking to folks in the National Traffic System, trying to figure out the overlays between interfacing with state areas, the fact that FEMA has the amateur radio capability and frequencies and all of their mobile radio deployments. But it was you had to have a forcing mechanism. You really had to push them into the corner and give them no other escape route for them to actually go, yeah, we may have to use ham radio. And to a certain degree, I find that's where I'm at with a lot of emergency management organizations. I know that in Georgia, they're big fans of going to the auxiliary communication requirement for hams to play with the state. Florida just announced they're going to do that. What's interesting on that is, and this is something I've run across kind of on the periphery. I kind of like to watch the politics of this play out in CQ and ARRL and conferences. Was that ham radio is irrelevant. We're a dying breed. We're all getting old. We're going to die. I'm like, I've noticed something. We're all getting old, but there's also other people getting old. And this tends to be a hobby best enjoyed when you can afford it, which is not generally in your youth. But if you've ever noticed as we get older and become silent keys, there's always somebody getting older, following right behind us, getting into the hobby and wanting to join and wanting Elmers. So I don't believe ham radio is dying off. I just think it's just a natural progression that most of us can't afford half the stuff we want to do or have the time to do it till we reach those ages where we're still active and able to support. So I don't think it's dying off. It's not relevant. I'm like, I just gave you a bunch of examples of where the only thing that was up was ham radio. And then the whole idea of Oxcom was, hey, we got all these hams out there. They're not really needed in disasters. Why don't we train them to serve as auxiliary communication folks to work the government radios, freeing up folks? And I'm like, that's actually not a bad idea, but it should not be an Oxcom versus ARRLs or RACES debate. It is when you're doing Oxcom, you're actually working on government radios and government systems, and the training's not bad. It's kind of a good thing to do, but it doesn't replace ARRLs, and it doesn't replace this primary responsibility of providing communications both in the immediate short distance area as well as long distance. And that's something that very few other organizations can bring to the table. The other thing I caution, I was down at the ARRL convention at Hamcation, and I spoke to this mainly because I was a little bit concerned that the new guy from Florida was the Florida Division of Emergency Management saying that they're going to require everybody to have Oxcom if they're going to participate with the state if they're a ham radio operator. And I'm like, let me tell you a little story about wildfires in 1998. We had gone through a very strong La Nina with very dry conditions, and we were burning state. At one point of the 67 counties in Florida, over 50 of them were in fire declared areas. We had run out of stuff. And back then, forestry had this requirement that if you were not typed and certified, and they called it red card, you couldn't fight fires, you couldn't participate. But they ran out of firefighters. They ran out of wildland firefighters. They ran out of the National Reserve. There was no more helicopters left in the inventory. And we were fortunate that year. Florida was about the only thing burning. They had more resources from the West Coast. I can remember guys getting off the plane from California, looking around going, what's the problem? Everything's green. And I had to explain to them, green stuff burns in Florida. They've never been in a coastal plain state during wildfires. But we ran out of everything. But forestry was insistent. If you're not red carded, we can't use you. And we're like, and I remember this because, I got Governor Childs, late Governor Childs was like getting pinged on why we hadn't activated the National Guard. And forestry's response was, we can't use them. They're not red carded. And this was kind of this vicious cycle. We were running out of stuff. I mean, we had fires and there was virtually nothing left to go. The other thing I found out was because forestry, the state of Florida is a cheap state. We don't pay firefighters just to sit around. So just about everybody in forestry had another job. Turned out most of the people running those plows were also the mechanics. So you know what was happening? They were out there 12 hours a day plowing. They'd come in and then they have to do maintenance on those tractors, grab a few hours sleep and go out the next day. And we're like, guys, we got National Guard guys. They do track stuff all the time. And most of this is just basic maintenance stuff. Why don't we get the National Guard to do your maintenance so you guys can get some rest before you kill them? Oh no, they're not red carded. They're not trained. We finally got them to accept it. We finally got them to let National Guard get some vehicles out there to let them haul around stuff. We finally got them to let National Guard get their fuel trucks out there to go fuel up tractors and stuff. And by the end of the year, we couldn't get them to let go of forestry. The next year, forestry, first thing they asked for is, can we activate the National Guard? And the guy that was making the request said, well, they're not red carded. He says, just get them activated. And my point was, and what I want to make the point for amateur radio was, the more exclusive you get on the badges and merit badges and training you have, the more holes you're going to have in the network. And I told this to ARRL when they were coming up with their levels for ARRLs. First of all, they went the wrong way. If you're a level 1, that should be your highest certification, not level 3. But they didn't listen to me because they were saying they were doing the instant command system. I said, well, ICS 1's the highest, and then the numbers go down. But if you look at that, I said, where's the entry point for the ham that just comes up on the air? You just rag choose, doesn't participate in areas, but they're up and running and they got emergency power. Well, they're not trained. I'm like, you can afford to throw them away. It's an emergency. In a disaster, anybody's up and working. You got to be able to count. So my caution is, yes, the training is great, but we need to understand that within the amateur radio community, there's only a certain percentage of folks that are going to go to the extremes and go do the Oxcom training and everything else. There are going to be a lot of people that aren't going to want to do areas. They got other interests in the hobby. But when it comes down to a disaster, it's who's up, who's transmitting, and who can pass information. And that, I think, is what is the core to amateur radio and what it brings to disasters. It is not a very efficient network. It is a very resilient network. You remember you think about how many ham operators will you actually have to take down their towers, their power, their radios, and everything else to keep anything from emitting in your communities. And that doesn't always lead itself to what government likes, is very efficient systems that they can point to, touch, and control. The one thing government really doesn't like is when they cannot control everything. And so their tendency is to try to make you meet their system instead of like, well, why can't we adapt to emergency management to amateur radio. So I don't think there's an Oxcom versus Aries, and I don't think Aries versus amateur radio, that if you don't have all the merit badges, you can't play. Because quite honestly, when everything is down, is who can get on the air. And we have to be able to embrace that. So while I support Oxcom, I also don't think it's there because there's nothing for amateur radio to do in disasters. I think there's a lot of things we need to be practicing. One of the things that our local club's doing and our new North Florida Aries coordinator is doing is just getting people used to passing and receiving traffic. Because if everything else is down, voice still works. You know, I know a lot of folks that are key, you know, CW will say, well, CW gets doing everything else. I'm like, yeah, I think we're at the point where the lowest common denominator among amateur radio is still voice, not CW. But if you can pass traffic and you're up and running, you can pass information. But that goes back to, are you trained? Do you know how to do traffic? Are you used to working and understanding propagation? Do you have emergency power? You know, because if the power goes out and you're off the air, it doesn't do us any good. Do you have backup antennas in case yours goes down? You know, I've been in a situation, I use a bunch of off-center fed dipoles. And so windstorms and limbs, I'm used to just going out almost every time there's something big coming through. And first thing I do is look to see if my antenna's on the ground or not. If it is, I just put it back up. You know, I got solar, I got you know, batteries, lithium batteries are great, I found. But it's to me, it's, you got to practice. You got to go for what a lot of people say, well, that probably won't happen. I'm like, in my world, that's what emergency management needs to focus on. It's not the high probability, high frequency event. It's the low probability, high consequence events. And the one thing that I can tell you in any disaster, the first thing you got to do is reestablish communications, whether it's physical and sending runners and physically getting there, or getting back up and passing information. But a county EOC that can't talk to anybody is a room full of people that can't do anything. And that's where amateur radio provides a capability.